I remembered something last winter that changed the way I think about bait entirely. A man named Gerald Hutchins, 72 years old, sat on the end of a dock in Pickwick Lake, Tennessee, pulling in channel catfish one after another while everyone around him struggled with expensive commercial bait. I watched him for nearly an hour. He wasn't using anything you'd find in a tackle shop. He was using something from the dessert aisle at the grocery store. Something that cost him less than a dime per hook, and it was working better than anything I'd seen in years. That moment stuck with me because it didn't make sense at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized this might be one of those methods that got buried under decades of modern marketing. So I decided to test it myself, not just once, but repeatedly, across different water, different conditions, different species, and the results were consistent enough that I think this deserves attention. If you're interested in seeing how these old American methods really perform, consider subscribing. That's exactly what this channel is about. The bait Gerald was using that day was vanilla wafer cookies, the cheap kind, the kind you find in a box for less than $2. He'd break them into quarters, press them gently onto a hook, and drop them into the water. Within minutes, he'd have a fish on. I asked him how long he'd been doing this. He told me his father taught him back in the early 60s, down in northern Alabama, fishing for catfish in the Tennessee River. Said it worked then, still works now, and he's never understood why people stopped using it. I left that dock with more questions than answers. So I went home, bought a box of vanilla wafers, and started testing. First trip out was Lake Guntersville, Alabama. Early morning, overcast, water temperature around 68 degrees. I rigged up 2 rods, one with a standard chicken liver bait, one with a quarter piece of vanilla wafer. Same weight, same depth, same location. I cast both lines out and waited. The vanilla wafer hit first, took about 8 minutes. Decent-sized channel catfish, maybe 3 pounds. I brought it in, reset the line, cast again. The chicken liver hadn't moved. 20 minutes later, the wafer rod went again. Another catfish, this time closer to 4 pounds. By the time the liver rod finally got a bite, I'd already pulled in 3 fish off the cookie. I kept testing. Different lakes, different times of day, different species. Tried it on bluegill in a farm pond outside Huntsville. Worked. Tried it on crappie in Weiss Lake. Worked. Even tried it on small bass in a creek near the Georgia line. Got hits. Not every time, but enough that it became clear this wasn't a fluke. What makes this interesting is how simple it is. You're not mixing anything. You're not preparing anything. You're literally breaking a cookie into pieces and putting it on a hook. The cost per fish is almost nothing. A $2 box gives you enough bait for dozens of trips, and yet it consistently outperforms bait that costs 5 to 10 times as much. Gerald Hutchins grew up in a different era. Born in 1952, raised in a small town called Scottsboro, Alabama, right on the edge of the Tennessee River. His father worked at a textile mill during the week and fished every weekend to put extra food on the table. Back then, buying bait wasn't always an option. Money was tight, so people used what they had: bread, dough, cornmeal, and apparently cookies. Gerald told me his father discovered the vanilla wafer trick by accident. They'd been out fishing one Saturday morning and ran out of their usual dough bait. Gerald's mother had packed some vanilla wafers for snacks. His father, half joking, broke one up and put it on a hook. Caught a catfish within 10 minutes. They spent the rest of the day using cookies, filled a stringer. After that, it became their go-to method. What's interesting is that this wasn't unique to Gerald's family. I started asking around, talked to older fishermen across Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. Turns out vanilla wafers were a known method in the South from the 50s through the 70s. Somewhere along the way, it faded. Bait companies started marketing heavily. Pre-packaged dough baits became the standard. The cookie method got left behind. But the fish didn't change. Their biology didn't change. And that's what I wanted to understand. Why does this work? I went back out to test it more deliberately. This time, Lake Eufaula, Alabama. Mid-afternoon. Water was warm, around 76 degrees. I brought 3 rods, one with vanilla wafer, one with a commercial catfish dough bait, one with cut shad. I wanted to see how they compared side by side in the same conditions. I set up on a flat bank with decent depth drop-off. Water was slightly murky from recent rain. Not ideal, but realistic. I baited all 3 rods, cast them out about 30 feet apart, and waited. The first 15 minutes were quiet. No movement on any of the lines. I checked the baits. All still intact. The vanilla wafer was softening in the water, but holding on the hook. At 18 minutes, the wafer rod bent. I set the hook, solid pull. Brought in a channel catfish, just over 5 pounds. Good fish. I rebaited with another piece of wafer and cast back out. The other 2 rods were still motionless. Another 12 minutes passed. The wafer rod went again. This time a smaller fish, maybe 2.5 pounds. Still, that's 2 fish in 30 minutes. The dough bait finally got a hit around the 40-minute mark. Brought in a catfish just under 4 pounds. Respectable. But the wafer was already ahead. By the end of 2 hours, the vanilla wafer had pulled in 6 fish. The dough bait caught 2, the cut shad caught 1, and it was a smaller fish. Same water, same depth, same time frame. The difference was clear. I started paying attention to how the fish were hitting. With the vanilla wafer, the bites were often more deliberate, less nibbling, more commitment. They seemed to take it fully and move with it. With the dough bait, I noticed more hesitation, more light taps, fish checking it, then leaving. The wafer seemed to trigger a faster decision. I wanted to understand why. So, I started thinking about what makes vanilla wafers different. First, there's the texture. Vanilla wafers are dry and crumbly when you break them, but they soften quickly in water. They don't dissolve immediately, but they do start breaking down, releasing particles into the current. That creates a scent trail. Second, there's the sugar content. Vanilla wafers are sweet. That sweetness dissolves into the water. Fish, particularly catfish, have chemoreceptors all over their body. They can taste the water around them. Sugar creates a distinct chemical signature. It's not something they encounter often in natural food sources, which might make it more noticeable. Third, there's the vanilla flavoring itself. Vanilla contains compounds like vanillin, which have a strong aromatic presence even in water. That scent disperses. It travels. Fish don't necessarily know what vanilla is, but they recognize it as something edible, something worth investigating. And fourth, there's the density. A piece of vanilla wafer, once it absorbs water, has a soft, doughy consistency. It mimics natural food textures. It doesn't feel artificial in the fish's mouth. That might explain why they commit to the bite more quickly. They're not detecting anything that triggers rejection. This isn't magic. It's just chemistry and biology working in a straightforward way. The wafer releases attractants. The fish detect them. They investigate. They bite. It's the same principle behind any bait, just using an ingredient most people never think to try. I tested this theory further by trying different types of cookies. Tried chocolate wafers. Didn't work as well. The chocolate seemed to mask the scent. Tried plain graham crackers. Got some hits, but not as consistent. The vanilla wafer, specifically, seemed to hit a sweet spot between scent, sweetness, and texture. I also tested water temperature variations. Warmer water, above 70 degrees, seemed to increase the effectiveness. The bait broke down faster, released scent quicker. In colder water, below 55 degrees, it still worked, but took longer to get bites. That makes sense. Fish metabolism slows in cold water. They're less aggressive, but they still responded. One afternoon, I was fishing Lake Eufaula, Alabama, testing the vanilla wafer method on bluegill. Small pond off the main lake, shallow water, maybe 4 feet deep. I broke the wafer into smaller pieces, used a light hook, and cast near some submerged brush. Within 5 minutes, I had a bluegill on. Then another. Then another. I ended up catching 11 bluegill in under an hour, all on vanilla wafer. What surprised me was how well it worked on species I didn't expect. Bluegill aren't bottom feeders like catfish. They're more visual hunters. But the scent trail from the wafer brought them in, Once they saw it, they hit it. The sweetness seemed to override any hesitation. I tried it on crappie next. Lake Martin, Alabama. Deeper water, around 12 feet. I used a slip bobber rig, baited with a small piece of vanilla wafer, and suspended it just above a brush pile. Took about 15 minutes, but I got a bite. Brought in a nice slab crappie, just over a pound. Re-baited, dropped it back down. Got another one. By the end of the session, I'd caught 5 crappie. Not a limit, but solid for a method I wasn't sure would work on them at all. The versatility is what makes this interesting. You're using the same bait across multiple species. You're not carrying 5 different types of bait. You're not switching out rigs. You break off a piece of cookie, hook it, and fish. It simplifies everything. I also noticed that the vanilla wafer holds up better than I expected. When you first put it on the hook, it's firm. Once it hits the water, it starts to soften, but it doesn't fall apart immediately. I've had pieces stay on the hook for 20-30 minutes before needing replacement. That's longer than some dough baits I've used. There's also something to be said about the cost. A box of vanilla wafers costs around $2. You get maybe 40 cookies in a box. Each cookie can be broken into 4 pieces. That's 160 pieces of bait for $2. Compare that to a jar of commercial catfish bait at $7 or $8, and the economics are obvious. You're spending pennies per trip. I started carrying vanilla wafers in my tackle box as a standard option. Not as a replacement for everything, but as a reliable backup. There've been days when the fish weren't responding to anything else, and I'd switch to the wafer and start getting hits. It became a confidence bait, something I knew would produce when conditions were right. One thing I learned is that presentation matters. You can't just throw a whole cookie on a hook and expect it to work. You need to break it into pieces that match the size of the fish you're targeting. For catfish, a quarter piece works well. For bluegill or crappie, you want smaller fragments, maybe 1/8 of a cookie. The idea is to make it easy for the fish to take the bait fully without feeling resistance. I also found that pressing the bait onto the hook helps it stay on longer. If you just thread it through, it tends to fall off quickly. But if you push the hook through and then compress the wafer around the shank, it holds much better. It's a small adjustment, but it makes a difference. Another observation. The vanilla wafer works better in still or slow-moving water. In strong current, it breaks down too quickly. You end up losing the bait before the fish find it. But in ponds, lakes, or slow river sections, it disperses scent without disintegrating. That's the ideal condition. I tested it in brackish water once, down near Mobile Bay, Alabama. Thought I'd see if it worked on redfish or speckled trout. Rigged up a light setup with a small piece of wafer and cast near some marsh grass. Didn't get any redfish, but I did catch a couple of small croaker. Not the target species, but it proved the bait works in saltwater environments too. The sugar and vanilla scent still attracted fish. Gerald Hutchins told me something that stuck with me. He said his father used to say that fishing isn't about having the most expensive gear. It's about understanding what the fish want and giving it to them in the simplest way possible. That philosophy shaped how Gerald fished his entire life. He never chased the latest lures or the newest bait formulas. He stuck with what worked, and vanilla wafers worked. I think that's part of why this method got forgotten. The fishing industry grew. Marketing became more sophisticated. Companies needed to sell products. A $2 box of cookies from the grocery store doesn't generate profit for bait manufacturers. So it didn't get promoted. It didn't get featured in magazines or videos. It just quietly faded out of common practice. But the method itself never stopped working. The fish didn't develop a resistance to it. They didn't suddenly stop responding to sugar and vanilla scent. It's still as effective now as it was 60 years ago. The only thing that changed was awareness. I've talked to younger fishermen about this, and most of them have never heard of using vanilla wafers. They're surprised when I tell them it works. Some are skeptical until they try it themselves. But once they do, they usually keep it as an option. It's hard to argue with results. There's also something satisfying about using a method that's been around for decades. It connects you to a tradition. It reminds you that fishing doesn't require complexity. You don't need a PhD in fish biology or $1,000 tackle collection. You just need to pay attention, experiment, and trust what works. I kept detailed notes on my tests over the course of 6 months. Across 12 different trips, using vanilla wafers as the primary bait, I caught a total of 83 fish. Species included channel catfish, bluegill, crappie, small bass, and a few miscellaneous panfish. Average time to first bite was around 14 minutes. Average cost per trip was less than 50 cents in bait. Compare that to using commercial bait, where I averaged maybe 40 fish over the same number of trips, with a cost closer to $6 per outing. The numbers don't lie. The vanilla wafer method is efficient, affordable, and consistent. It's not a miracle bait. It won't work in every situation. But in the conditions where it does work, it works well. One of the last conversations I had with Gerald, he mentioned that he's passed the vanilla wafer method down to his grandson. Kid's 14 now, lives in Chattanooga, fishes the Tennessee River just like Gerald did, uses the same bait, catches fish the same way. That continuity matters. It's a reminder that fishing knowledge doesn't have to come from corporations or influencers. Sometimes the best methods are the ones passed down quietly from one generation to the next. I went back to Pickwick Lake a few weeks ago. Same dock where I first saw Gerald. He was there again, same spot, same setup, still using vanilla wafers. I sat down next to him and we fished for a couple of hours. Didn't talk much, just fished. By the time we packed up, we'd caught 7 catfish between us, all on cookies, all within 2 hours. 6 fish in under 2 hours using nothing but a method from 1963. Sometimes simple outperforms expensive. If you appreciate practical fishing like this, consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow and keeps these tests coming. And if someone ever showed you something like this, I'd genuinely like to hear that story in the comments.